Rosa Martinez pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Riverside Community Center, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. The smell of fresh coffee and old books filled the air as she made her way down the hallway, past colorful bulletin boards covered with announcements for pottery classes and book clubs. At 58, she felt a little out of place among all the cheerful posters, but there was something exciting about finally doing something just for herself. The music appreciation classroom was smaller than she had expected. About 15 folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing an old upright piano and a whiteboard covered with musical notes. Rosa chose a seat in the back corner, close to the window where she could watch the afternoon sunlight filter through the maple trees outside. She pulled a small notebook and pen from her purse, the same ones she used to jot down grocery lists and reminders for her kids. Other students began filing in, chatting easily with each other like old friends. Most were around her age or older, dressed in comfortable sweaters and sensible shoes. Rosa listened to their conversations about retirement plans, grandchildren's soccer games, and weekend trips to the farmer's market. She smoothed down her simple, blue cardigan and wondered if she looked as nervous as she felt. "Good afternoon, everyone." A tall man with graying hair and kind eyes entered the room carrying a stack of papers. Professor Williams had the sort of gentle energy that made people feel at ease right away. "I see some familiar faces and some new ones too. Welcome to Music Appreciation for Adults." He began going around the room, asking each person to introduce themselves and share why they had decided to take the class. Rosa's stomach tightened as she realized her turn was coming. Mrs. Chen talked about wanting to understand the classical music her daughter played. Mr. Peterson mentioned his love for jazz and wanting to learn more about different composers. Betty from the senior center said she had always wondered about opera, but never knew where to start. When Professor Williams looked at Rosa with an encouraging smile, she felt her cheeks warm. "I'm Rosa Martinez," she said quietly. "I work at the hospital downtown in housekeeping. I've always loved music, but I never really learned much about it formally. I thought maybe it was time to change that." The professor nodded approvingly. "That's wonderful, Rosa. Music has a way of enriching our lives no matter when we discover it." She smiled back, grateful that he didn't ask any follow-up questions. What Rosa didn't tell the class was that music had been her whole world once. Upon a time, growing up in a small town outside Mexico City, she had started playing piano when she was 5 years old. Her grandmother, Abuela Carmen, had saved every peso she could to pay for lessons with the local church organist. Rosa still remembered the feel of those first piano keys under her small fingers, how the music seemed to flow through her like water finding its natural path. By the time she was 12, Rosa was performing in regional competitions. Her teachers said she had un don especial, a special gift. They talked about conservatory training and concert halls. Rosa's parents worked extra shifts at the textile factory to support her musical education, believing their daughter might be their family's ticket to a better life. At 17, Rosa had won a scholarship to the prestigious National Conservatory of Music in Mexico City. For 2 years, she studied with some of the country's finest piano instructors. She performed in student recitals, played with small orchestras, and dreamed of concert stages in Vienna and New York. Her technique was flawless, her musical interpretation mature beyond her years. Then everything changed. Rosa's father was injured in an accident at the factory, and her mother fell ill with diabetes complications. The medical bills piled up quickly. Rosa made the hardest decision of her young life. She left the conservatory to work and help support her family. She told herself it would be temporary, just until things got better. But life had other plans. She met Carlos, a kind man who worked construction, and they fell in love. Marriage came quickly, then children. 5 beautiful babies who filled her world with joy and chaos. There was no time for piano practice between diaper changes, school pickups, and the 2 cleaning jobs she worked to help make ends meet. When Carlos was laid off for 6 months, Rosa took on a 3rd job cleaning offices at night. The old upright piano they bought at a garage sale when the kids were small mostly sat silent. Sometimes late at night after everyone was asleep, Rosa would sit at the bench and play softly, her fingers remembering melodies from long ago. But those moments became rarer as the demands of raising a family grew stronger. Now, with her youngest finally graduated from high school and starting college, Rosa found herself with something she hadn't had in decades: a little time for herself. The music appreciation class had seemed like a safe way to reconnect with her old passion, without drawing attention to her past. As Professor Williams began his first lecture about the history of classical music, Rosa found herself transported. He played recordings of Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, pieces she knew intimately but hadn't heard in years. Her hands moved slightly in her lap, fingers unconsciously following familiar passages. When he played a section of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, Rosa had to bite her lip to keep from humming along. "Can anyone tell me what makes Chopin's piano music so distinctive?" Professor Williams asked the class. Rosa knew the answer immediately: the way Chopin wrote for the piano like he was writing poetry, how his melodies sang like human voices, the complex emotions he could express in just a few measures. But she stayed quiet, letting Mrs. Chen guess that it sounded very romantic, and Mr. Peterson mentioned that it seemed pretty complicated. After class, Rosa walked slowly to her car, her mind buzzing with musical memories. She had forgotten how much she missed talking about music, thinking about music, being surrounded by people who cared about it. The hour and a half had passed like minutes. At home that evening, Rosa sat at her kitchen table grading papers from her youngest daughter's teaching job, a side hustle to help pay for textbooks. The house was quiet for once, with Carlos working, his night shift at the warehouse, and the kids all busy with their own lives. She found herself humming one of the Chopin pieces Professor Williams had played. Rosa walked over to the old piano in the corner of the living room. She lifted the keyboard cover carefully. It stuck a little after years of humidity changes. She sat on the wobbly bench and placed her hands on the keys. Even though the piano was badly out of tune, when she played a simple C major scale, it sounded like coming home. She played for just a few minutes, keeping the volume low so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Her fingers were stiff from years of cleaning and scrubbing, but the muscle memory was still there, buried deep but not forgotten. As she closed the keyboard cover and headed to bed, Rosa smiled to herself. Maybe this music class would be good for her after all. The next week, Rosa arrived at class a few minutes early. She had spent the week looking forward to it more than she wanted to admit. Professor Williams was setting up his laptop and speakers, preparing for another journey through musical history. Rosa took the same seat by the window and opened her notebook, ready to learn about composers and time periods she already knew by heart, but from a perspective she had never experienced, as a student rather than a performer. She had no idea that in just a few weeks her carefully constructed quiet life would be turned completely upside down. 5 weeks had passed since Rosa first walked into that music appreciation classroom, and she had settled into a comfortable routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 o'clock, she would finish her morning shift at the hospital, grab a quick lunch from the cafeteria, and drive the 10 minutes to the community center. The class had become the highlight of her week. She loved listening to Professor Williams explain the differences between Baroque and Romantic music. She enjoyed hearing Mrs. Chen ask innocent questions about why certain pieces sounded sad or happy. Even Mr. Peterson's jazz comparisons, while sometimes off the mark, showed genuine curiosity. Rosa had found her place as the quiet student who asked thoughtful questions, but never revealed too much about her own knowledge. During their study of the classical period, Rosa had carefully asked about Mozart's piano sonatas without mentioning she had once performed 3 of them in a single recital. When they discussed Beethoven, she wondered aloud about his later works without revealing she had spent months mastering the complexity of his final piano sonatas. She had become an expert at appearing curious rather than knowledgeable. But today felt different. There was an energy in Professor Williams' voice that hadn't been there before, and he had arrived with a stack of colorful flyers that he placed on each chair before class started. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "I hope you're all as energized about music as I am today, because I have something special to share with you." Rosa picked up the flyer from her chair and felt her stomach flutter. In bold letters across the top, It read, Spring Showcase, Adult. Education music classes present. An evening of musical discovery. Professor Williams continued, The Community Center is hosting a showcase in 3 weeks where students from all our music classes will perform for family and friends. It's completely voluntary, of course, but I think it would be a wonderful way to demonstrate what we've learned together. The room buzzed with nervous chatter. Mrs. Chen immediately shook her head, laughing. Oh no, I couldn't possibly perform for people. I don't even sing in the shower. Several other students echoed her concerns, mentioning stage fright and lack of experience, but Professor Williams was prepared for their reluctance. Now, before you all panic, let me explain. This isn't about being perfect or professional. It's about celebrating the joy of music and sharing what we've discovered in our journey together. The performances can be very simple, singing a folk song, playing a basic piece on piano, or even just explaining what you've learned about a particular composer. He walked over to the piano and sat at the bench. For example, we could have someone demonstrate the difference between a waltz and a march by playing simple examples. Or maybe someone could sing a traditional song from their culture and explain its musical elements. Rosa watched as a few students began to look more interested. Betty from the senior center raised her hand tentatively. Could I maybe talk about opera? I've been reading about it since our unit last month. Absolutely perfect, Professor Williams beamed. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm hoping for. Over the next few minutes, several students volunteered for simple presentations. Mr. Peterson offered to bring his harmonica and play some blues scales while explaining their structure. Mrs. Chen surprised everyone by volunteering to sing a Chinese lullaby her grandmother had taught her. 2 other students decided to work together on a presentation about the differences between major and minor keys. Professor Williams wrote each volunteer's name and topic on the whiteboard. Rosa counted 7 participants so far, and she felt relieved that she could simply attend as an audience member. She had no desire to draw attention to herself or risk questions about her musical background. Wonderful, Professor Williams said, stepping back from the board. Now I'd love to have someone represent each major musical period we've studied. We have the Baroque covered with Mrs. Patterson's Bach discussion and classical with the Mozart presentation. But we're missing the Romantic period. He moved to a filing cabinet beside the piano and pulled out a folder of sheet music. I was hoping someone might be willing to attempt a romantic piece on piano. Now I know this is asking a lot, and I certainly don't expect perfection. Rosa's hands grew cold as she watched him flip through the pages of music. She recognized several pieces immediately. Schumann's Traumerei, Liszt's Liebestraum No. 3. And then her heart nearly stopped. There it was, Chopin's Minute Waltz, the piece she had performed dozens of times, including at her final student recital at the conservatory. Professor Williams held up the sheet music for everyone to see? This is Chopin's famous Minute Waltz. Now don't let the name fool you. It's not meant to be played in exactly 1 minute, though some pianists try. It's actually quite challenging, with rapid passages and delicate fingerwork. He played a few measures on the piano, his technique competent but basic. Rosa winced internally at his timing in the more complex sections, but she kept her expression neutral. I know this might seem intimidating, he continued, but I could work with someone, individually, to simplify it. We could slow it down, maybe play just the main melody line or even just the first section. The important thing is to give our audience a taste of the romantic style. The classroom fell silent. Rosa could hear the clock ticking on the wall and the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. She stared at her hands folded in her lap, willing herself to remain invisible. Come now, Professor Williams encouraged gently. I can see in your faces that some of you are tempted. Remember, this is about learning and sharing, not about being concert ready. Mrs. Chen broke the silence. Professor, that looks incredibly difficult. I can barely read music, let alone play something like that. I understand completely, he replied, but you'd be surprised what's possible with some practice and simplification. Sometimes the pieces that look most challenging can be broken down into manageable parts. Rosa felt his eyes scanning the room, looking for any sign of interest, She tried to make herself smaller in her chair, focusing intently on her notebook as if she were taking important notes. "Rosa," Professor Williams said suddenly, and her head snapped up. "You always ask such insightful questions about the piano pieces we study. I can tell you really listen to the musical details. Would you consider giving this a try?" Every pair of eyes in the room turned to look at her. Rosa felt heat rising in her cheeks as she shook her head quickly. "Oh no, I couldn't. I've never really played piano before, I mean, not seriously." It wasn't exactly a lie. She had never played seriously in the way he meant, not as an adult student learning for fun. Her serious playing belonged to a different life, one she had carefully tucked away, but Professor Williams wasn't giving up easily. "That's exactly why it would be perfect. You have such good musical instincts from listening. Sometimes natural musicality is more important than years of formal training." Rosa felt trapped. The other students were nodding encouragingly, and she could see the hope in Professor Williams' eyes. She desperately searched for a polite way to decline without seeming rude or drawing more attention to herself. "I really don't think I'm the right person," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe someone else would be better suited for it." "Nonsense," said Betty from across the room. "Rosa, you're always so thoughtful about the music we hear. I bet you'd do wonderfully." Other voices joined in with gentle encouragement. Mrs. Chen mentioned how Rosa always seemed to understand the emotional content of pieces better than anyone else. Mr. Peterson pointed out that she had great rhythm when she unconsciously tapped along to the music during class. Rosa felt herself being pulled into a current she couldn't escape. Professor Williams approached her chair and knelt down beside it, his voice kind but persistent. "Look, Rosa, I can see you're nervous, and that's completely natural. But I have a good feeling about this. You don't have to decide right now. Take the music home, look it over, and see how you feel. If it's too much, we'll find something simpler. But I have a hunch you might surprise yourself." Before she could protest further, he had placed the sheet music in her hands. The familiar title stared up at her. Minute Waltz in D-flat major, by 64, No. 1 by Frédéric Chopin. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the paper. "Just think about it," Professor Williams said with a warm smile. "That's all I'm asking." As the class ended and students began gathering their things, Rosa sat frozen in her chair, staring at the music in her hands. This piece had once been as natural to her as breathing. She had performed it for her final conservatory jury, earning the highest marks possible. The judges had praised her interpretation, saying she captured both the playfulness and the underlying melancholy that made Chopin so special. Now, 35 years later, she was being asked to pretend she had never seen it before, to stumble through it like a beginner while hiding every instinct that screamed the correct fingering, phrasing, and interpretation. Rosa folded the music carefully and slipped it into her purse. As she walked to her car, she wondered how she had gotten herself into this situation, and more importantly, how she was going to get out of it without revealing the secret she had spent decades protecting. Rosa sat in her car outside the community center for a long time after class ended, staring at the sheet music resting on her passenger seat. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the parking lot, and she could see other students, walking to their cars, chatting excitedly about the upcoming showcase. Mrs. Chen waved at her through the windshield, giving her an encouraging thumbs up before driving away. The drive home was a blur of stop signs and traffic lights. Rosa's mind kept wandering to the music beside her, to memories of practice rooms and concert halls that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. When she pulled into her driveway, she sat for another few minutes, gathering the courage to take the sheet music inside. Her small house was quiet when she entered. Carlos wouldn't be home from his shift for another 3 hours, and their youngest daughter Lucia was at her job at the bookstore downtown. Rosa kicked off her work shoes and padded to the kitchen in her stocking feet, setting her purse on the counter next to a stack of bills and grocery coupons. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, finally pulling out the Chopin music. The notes looked exactly as she remembered them, those cascading runs in the right hand, the playful melody that danced over a steady left-hand accompaniment. Her eyes moved across the page automatically, hearing the music in her head as clearly as if someone were playing it in the next room. Rosa closed her eyes and let herself remember the first time she had learned this piece. She was 19 in her second year at the conservatory. Her teacher, Maestro Hernandez, had assigned it to her after hearing her play some Chopin nocturnes. "You have the touch for Chopin," he had told her. "Your hands understand his poetry." She had practiced this waltz for months, working through every phrase until it felt natural under her fingers. The technical challenges that would frighten most pianists, the rapid chromatic runs, the delicate balance between melody and accompaniment, the precise pedaling required for the flowing sound, had become second nature to her. Opening her eyes, Rosa looked across her living room at the old upright piano in the corner. It had been her family's most treasured possession for 20 years, even when money was tight, and they had to choose between piano tuning and school supplies. The piano usually won, because Rosa couldn't bear to hear it sound so out of tune when one of the kids wanted to play Happy Birthday or pick out a simple melody. Rosa walked over to the piano and lifted the bench lid, where she kept her few remaining pieces of sheet music. Most of it was children's music, beginner books she had bought when her kids were small, hoping to teach them what she knew. Only Lucia had shown real interest, taking lessons for 3 years before soccer and friends became more important. Beneath the children's books, wrapped in an old towel, were Rosa's conservatory pieces. She hadn't looked at them in years, but she couldn't bring herself to throw them away either. She unwrapped the bundle carefully and found her old copy of the same Chopin waltz, yellowed with age and marked with pencil notations in her young handwriting. The phone rang, startling her out of her memories. It was her daughter Maria calling from Phoenix, where she worked as a nurse. "Hi, Mom. How are you? How's your music class going?" Rosa found herself telling Maria about the showcase, about Professor Williams asking her to play the piano piece. She tried to keep her voice casual, but Maria knew her too well. "Mom, that's exciting. You should totally do it. I remember when we were kids, you used to play the most beautiful music. I always wondered why you stopped." "Oh, mija, that was so long ago. I was never that good anyway." "Are you kidding? I used to fall asleep to you playing piano when I was little. You had such gentle hands on the keys. Dad always said you could have been a famous pianist if things had been different." After they hung up, Rosa sat back down at the kitchen table with the Chopin music spread in front of her. Carlos had said that. She had never known he understood how much music had meant to her, how much she had given up. They had never really talked about her conservatory years. There had always been too much happening in the present to dwell on the past. That evening, after Carlos came home and they had eaten dinner together, Rosa found herself standing by the piano again. Carlos was watching television in his recliner, half asleep after his long day loading trucks at the warehouse. "Carlos," she said quietly, "remember that music class I'm taking?" He muted the television and turned to look at her. "The one you love so much? What about it?" "The teacher wants me to play piano in a showcase, a piece by Chopin." Carlos sat up straighter, suddenly more alert. "Rosa, that's wonderful. You should do it." "I don't know. It's been so long since I played anything serious. What if I embarrass myself?" Carlos stood up and walked over to her, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "Mi amor, I've heard you play late at night when you think no one is listening. You still have magic in these fingers. Maybe it's time to let other people hear it too." Rosa felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You never said anything. I didn't want to make you sad by bringing up old dreams. But Rosa, some dreams don't have to stay buried forever." The next morning, Rosa called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. She couldn't concentrate on mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms when her mind was full of music. Instead, she spent the morning at the piano. Her fingers were stiff. At first, uncertain on keys that had once been as familiar as her own heartbeat. But slowly, carefully, she began to work through the Chopin waltz. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of dishwater and disinfectant, but still there. She played it through once, slowly, wincing at the places where her technique had gotten rusty. Then again, a little faster. By the third time, through, something magical happened. Her hands remembered not just the notes but the feeling of the music, the playful lightness of the main melody, the way the left hand should dance rather than plod, the subtle rubato that made Chopin's sound like conversation rather than exercise. Rosa played for 3 hours that morning, stopping only when her hands started to cramp. She hadn't realized how much physical stamina piano playing required, how her fingers needed to rebuild their strength and flexibility. That afternoon, she arrived at music class early. Professor Williams was setting up for the day's lesson on romantic composers, and he looked up with surprise when she walked in. "Rosa, how lovely to see you. Did you have a chance to look at the Chopin piece?" Rosa took a deep breath. She had rehearsed this conversation in her car, trying to find the right words. "I did look at it. It's very beautiful music." "And?" His eyes were hopeful. I think maybe I could try it, but I'm very nervous about performing in front of people." Professor Williams' face lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. "Rosa, that's fantastic. Don't worry about being nervous. That's completely natural. We'll work together to make sure you feel prepared." "I might need some help with the harder parts," Rosa said, the lie feeling strange on her tongue. "Of course, we can schedule some individual practice time. I'm so excited about this, Rosa. I have a feeling you're going to surprise everyone, including yourself." As other students began arriving for class, Rosa felt a mixture of excitement and terror settling in her stomach. She had committed herself now. In 2.5 weeks, she would sit at a piano in front of an audience and play a piece that had once been the centerpiece of her musical repertoire. She would have to pretend to struggle with passages that her fingers could play in their sleep, act grateful for advice about interpretation she had mastered decades ago. But maybe, just maybe, it would be worth it to feel like a musician again, even if it was just for 3 minutes on a community center stage. The hardest part would be holding back, playing well enough to honor the music, but not so well that people started asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. Rosa had spent 35 years hiding her light under a bushel. Now she had to figure out how to let just a little bit of it show, enough to share the joy of music without revealing the depth of talent she had spent so long keeping secret. As Professor Williams began the day's lesson, Rosa opened her notebook and prepared to take notes about composers and musical periods she knew better than he did. But for the first time in decades, she was looking forward to sitting at a piano bench in front of other people, even if they would never know they were, hearing an artist who had once dreamed of concert halls and standing ovations. The morning of the showcase, Rosa woke up before her alarm clock. She lay in bed listening to Carlos breathing beside her and watching the early sunlight creep through their bedroom curtains. Her stomach felt like it was full of butterflies doing somersaults. She hadn't felt this nervous about performing since her conservatory days, and back then the nerves had been different. The excitement of a young artist eager to share her gift with the world. Today's nerves were more complicated. She was nervous about playing well enough to honor Chopin's beautiful music, but also terrified of playing too well and raising questions she wasn't prepared to answer. For the past 2 weeks, she had been practicing a careful balance, allowing her natural musicality to show while deliberately holding back the full depth of her training and experience. Rosa got up quietly and made coffee in the kitchen, standing by the window and watching her neighbor Mrs. Patterson water her garden. Everything looked so normal, so ordinary. In a few hours, she would be sitting at a piano in front of 40 or 50 people, playing music that had once been as natural to her as breathing. The practice sessions with Professor Williams had been both wonderful and torture. He had been so encouraging, so pleased with her rapid progress on the piece. "Rosa, you're picking this up remarkably quickly," he had said during their second practice session. "You must have a real natural talent for piano." She had smiled and nodded, accepting his compliments while her fingers itched to show him what the piece could really sound like when played by someone who truly understood its intricacies. During one particularly frustrating moment, when he suggested she simplify a passage that she could have played flawlessly with her eyes closed, Rosa had to excuse herself to get a drink of water just to avoid screaming. But there had been beautiful moments too. Moments when she allowed herself to play with just a little more expression, when she let her hands remember the joy of making music. Professor Williams had noticed those moments, his eyes lighting up with the recognition that something special was happening, even if he couldn't quite identify what it was. "There's something about the way you approach this piece," he had told her just yesterday. "It's like you understand what Chopin was trying to say. That's very rare, especially for someone just starting to learn piano seriously." Carlos found her in the kitchen an hour later, still in her pajamas and staring out the window with her coffee cup clutched in both hands. "Buenos dias, mi amor," he said, kissing the top of her head. "How are you feeling about tonight?" "Terrified," Rosa admitted. "What if I mess up? What if I forget the music? What if my hands shake too much to play?" Carlos poured himself coffee and sat down at the table beside her. "Rosa, do you remember when Lucia was 5 and she had to sing in the school Christmas pageant?" Rosa smiled despite her nerves. "She was so scared she hid under her bed an hour before we had to leave." "And what did you tell her? That the people watching weren't there to judge her. They were there to enjoy the music and be proud of her for being brave enough to share it." "Exactly. Tonight those people aren't coming to judge you either. They're coming to celebrate what you've all learned together. Professor Williams told me at the grocery store last week that he's never had a student pick up piano as quickly as you have. He's proud of you, Rosa." After Carlos left for work, Rosa spent the morning cleaning the house. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. She dusted every surface twice, reorganized her closet, and made an elaborate lunch that she was too nervous to eat. By afternoon, she couldn't avoid the piano any longer. She sat down at the bench and played through the Chopin waltz one final time. Her fingers moved confidently over the keys, and for just a moment she allowed herself to play it the way she felt it, with all the nuance and expression that years of training had taught her. The melody sang out with crystal clarity, the rapid passages flowing like water, the gentle phrases breathing with natural rubato. It was beautiful, it was perfect, and it was exactly what she couldn't do tonight if she wanted to maintain her carefully constructed cover story. Rosa closed the piano lid and went to get ready. She had bought a new dress for the occasion, nothing fancy, just a simple navy blue dress with small pearl buttons that made her feel elegant without being overdressed. She did her hair carefully and put on the small gold earrings Carlos had given her for their 20th wedding anniversary. The community center was buzzing with activity when Rosa arrived at 6 o'clock. Families were streaming in, children running around in their best clothes, elderly couples holding hands and looking for good seats. Rosa saw Mrs. Chen's grown daughter helping her grandmother to a chair in the front row, and Mr. Peterson's wife adjusting the microphone on the small stage. The performance space was actually the community center's main hall, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small raised platform. The same old upright piano from their classroom had been moved to the stage, along with music stands and a microphone for the students who were giving presentations rather than performing. Rosa found Professor Williams backstage, really just a curtained-off area behind the platform, going over the program with his students. Everyone looked nervous and excited, dressed in their nicest clothes and holding their music with careful hands. "Rosa, you look lovely," Professor Williams said when he spotted her. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," she admitted. "That's perfectly normal. Remember, you've been practicing beautifully. Just play like you did in our sessions, and everything will be wonderful." The program began with Betty's presentation about opera, which was charming and informative. She had prepared slides showing different opera houses and played recordings of famous arias while explaining what made each one special. The audience clapped enthusiastically, and Rosa could see Betty's family beaming with pride from the third row. Mr. Peterson followed with his harmonica demonstration, playing blues scales and explaining how they created different moods in music. Mrs. Chen's Chinese lullaby brought tears to several people's eyes, including her own granddaughter, who was hearing the family song for the first time. Each performance was met with warm applause and encouraging smiles. Rosa began to relax slightly as she watched her classmates share their musical discoveries. These weren't professional performances. They were heartfelt expressions of learning and growth, and the audience was clearly enjoying every moment. "Rosa, Martinez will now perform Chopin's Minute Waltz," Professor Williams announced as Rosa's turn approached. Rosa has been working very hard on this challenging piece, and I think you'll all be impressed by her dedication and natural musical ability. Rosa walked onto the small stage, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The audience looked larger from up here. She could see Carlos in the fourth row, giving her an encouraging nod. Her daughter Lucia had driven in from college and was sitting beside him, holding up her phone to record the performance. Several of her co-workers from the hospital had come too, looking proud and slightly surprised to see quiet Rosa Martinez about to play classical piano. She sat at the piano bench and adjusted the height, trying to buy herself a few seconds to calm her racing heart. The keys looked familiar and welcoming under the stage lights. Rosa placed her hands in position and took a deep breath. This was it. After 35 years of hiding her musical abilities, she was about to perform again. Not as the promising, young conservatory student she had once been, but as Rosa Martinez, hospital housekeeper and mother of 5, who had somehow found her way back to the music that had once defined her entire world. She looked out at the audience one more time, seeing expectant faces and gentle smiles. These people weren't expecting perfection. They were expecting honesty, effort, and the simple joy of music shared between friends. Rosa placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. Rosa's fingers hovered over the piano keys for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. The community center hall was completely quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and someone's cell phone vibrating on silent mode. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, waiting patiently for her to begin. She had planned this moment so carefully. She would play the piece competently but simply, like a dedicated adult student who had worked hard but was still learning. She would make a few small mistakes, nothing major, just enough to seem realistic. She would keep the tempo steady rather than using the subtle timing changes that made Chopin come alive. She would play the notes correctly but hold back the musical poetry that her heart knew how to express. But as Rosa sat there on that piano bench, looking out at the warm, encouraging faces of her classmates and their families, something shifted inside her. These people had welcomed her into their community with open arms. Professor Williams had been endlessly patient and kind. Her fellow students had supported her and cheered her on. Carlos and Lucia had driven across town to hear her play. They deserved better than a performance held back by fear and secrecy. The music deserved better too. Rosa closed her eyes for a moment and let herself remember why she had fallen in love with this piece 35 years ago. It wasn't just the technical challenge or the way it showed off a pianist's skill. It was the story it told, playful and light on the surface but with deeper currents of longing and bittersweet beauty flowing underneath. Chopin had written it during a time of exile from his homeland, and somehow he had captured both joy and sadness in the same melody. When Rosa opened her eyes and placed her hands on the keys, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She was going to play this piece the way it deserved to be played. She was going to honor Chopin, honor the music, and honor the part of herself that she had kept hidden for far too long. The first notes floated out into the hall with crystal clarity, not tentative or careful but confident and sure. Rosa's right hand began the familiar melody, each note perfectly placed and singing with warmth. Her left hand provided the waltz accompaniment, steady but alive, dancing rather than merely marking time. The audience stirred slightly. This didn't sound like a beginner working through a difficult piece. This sounded like music. As Rosa moved into the first rapid passage, her fingers flew over the keys with breathtaking precision. Every note was clear and even, the chromatic runs flowing like water cascading down a mountainside. There were no hesitations, no fumbled transitions, no careful pauses to find the next hand position. Her fingers seemed to know exactly where they were going, guided by muscle memory that had been waiting decades to express itself again. Professor Williams, sitting in the front row, felt his mouth drop open. This was not the student he had been working with for the past 2 weeks. This was someone else entirely. Someone with years of serious training, someone who understood this music from the inside out. The melody returned, but now Rosa allowed herself to shape it with the subtle rubato that made Chopin's phrases breathe like human speech. She leaned into certain notes, letting them sing out above the accompaniment, then pulled back for the more delicate passages. Her hands moved independently with the kind of coordination that took years to develop, the left hand maintaining perfect timing while the right hand bent and shaped the melody with expressive freedom. Mrs. Chen grabbed her daughter's arm. "Is this the same woman from our class?" she whispered. In the fourth row, Carlos felt tears welling up in his eyes. He had heard Rosa play like this before, late at night when she thought no one was listening, but never in front of other people. Never with this kind of confidence and joy. He could see his wife's shoulders relaxing as she settled into the music, letting go of whatever had been holding her back all these years. Rosa reached the middle section of the piece, where Chopin had written some of his most technically demanding passages. Her hands crossed and recrossed with balletic grace, the rapid scales and arpeggios sparkling like jewels under the stage lights. But it wasn't just technical display. Every note served the musical line, contributing to the overall story the piece was telling. The audience had gone completely still. Even the restless children had stopped fidgeting, somehow sensing that they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just someone playing notes on a piano. This was an artist communicating directly through music, speaking a language that touched something deep in the listeners' hearts. Betty, who had opened the program with her opera presentation, felt goosebumps rising on her arms. She had been to professional concerts that didn't move her as much as this performance was moving her right now. As Rosa approached the final section, she allowed herself one moment of pure indulgence. She had always loved the way Chopin brought back the opening melody at the end, but with subtle variations that made it feel both familiar and surprising. Her fingers caressed each phrase, drawing out every bit of beauty hidden in the notes. The rapid finale passage, which had intimidated so many pianists over the years, flowed from her hands with joyful abandon. This was music at its purest, not showing off but celebrating. Celebrating the incredible human ability to create beauty from organized sound, to touch hearts and souls through the movement of fingers on ivory keys. The final chord rang out, in the hushed hall, and Rosa lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment, the silence was so complete that she wondered if she had somehow dreamed the entire performance. Then the applause began. It started slowly, just a few people clapping, but within seconds it had erupted into something Rosa had never expected. People were rising to their feet, applauding with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for professional concerts. She could see tears on many faces, including Professor Williams, who was shaking his head in amazement as he clapped. Carlos was on his feet immediately, clapping so hard his hands hurt. Lucia was crying and cheering at the same time, holding her phone up to capture her mother's moment of triumph. The hospital workers who had come to support their quiet colleague looked stunned. They had expected to politely applaud a nice try, not to witness a performance that belonged on a concert stage. Rosa stood up from the piano bench on unsteady legs, overwhelmed by the response. She had forgotten what it felt like to share music with an audience, to feel that magical connection when a performance truly communicates. The applause seemed to go on forever, people calling out "bravo" and "beautiful." Professor Williams bounded onto the stage, his face shining with amazement and delight. "Rosa," he said, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "Who are you?" She looked out at the audience, at Mrs. Chen wiping tears from her cheeks, at Mr. Peterson shaking his head in wonder, at all these people who had become her friends without ever knowing who she really was. For 35 years, she had introduced herself as Rosa Martinez, hospital housekeeper, mother of 5. But that was only part of the truth. "I'm Rosa Martinez," she said into the microphone, her voice stronger than she had expected. "And I graduated from the National Conservatory of Music in Mexico City when I was 21. The hall erupted again, but this time it was different. This wasn't just applause for a beautiful performance. It was celebration for a woman who had finally allowed herself to be seen completely. As Rosa stood on that small stage in a community center, surrounded by the warmth and love of people who had supported her without knowing her secret, she realized something important. She had spent decades thinking that part of her life was over, that the musician she had once been was gone forever. But music doesn't disappear. It just waits. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to let it, it comes flooding back, more beautiful than ever because of everything we've learned while it was sleeping. The standing ovation continued for several more minutes, but Rosa barely heard it. She was thinking about tomorrow, about the piano waiting in her living room, about all the music still inside her fingers, waiting to be shared with the world again.